15 NATO armies, the absolute best infantry formations from 15 allied nations, all converging on a single training area for the largest multinational ground combat exercise in NATO's recent history. Each nation sent what they considered their finest. Each believed their forces represented the pinnacle of infantry capability. Each expected their soldiers to perform at a level that would earn respect from allies and demonstrate national military excellence. What happened over the following 3 weeks shattered assumptions, damaged egos, and produced results so decisive that senior American military officials demanded an explanation. One force so thoroughly dominated every phase of the exercise that the phrase outperformed became an understatement. They did not merely outperform, they exposed a gap between themselves and every other participating force that forced a complete reassessment of what NATO infantry training actually produces. The force in question was the British Royal Marines Commandos, and when American generals saw the after-action analysis, their response was not what anyone expected. They did not dismiss the results. They did not make excuses. They did something that reveals more about professional military culture than the exercise itself. By the end of this video, you will understand exactly what happened during those 3 weeks, why British commandos achieved what they achieved, and why the American response matters more than the British victory. The exercise was designated Northern Shield. The location was Norway's Finnmark region, the northernmost territory of mainland Europe. This was not a randomly selected training area. Finnmark represents one of the most strategically critical and operationally challenging environments on the NATO frontier. Shared border with Russia. Arctic conditions, minimal infrastructure, terrain that ranges from frozen tundra to vertical mountain faces. If conventional conflict ever comes to NATO's northern flank, Finnmark is where it will be decided. The exercise was designed to test which NATO forces could actually fight there. 15 nations participated with ground combat formations. Norway, obviously, as the host nation. The United States with a reinforced Marine battalion. United Kingdom with 45 Commando. Royal Marines, Germany with a Gebirgsjäger Mountain Infantry Company. France with a Chasseurs Alpins Mountain Warfare Unit. Italy with their Alpini troops. Spain, Poland, Netherlands, Canada, Denmark, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and Belgium all contributed infantry elements. This was not a token exercise. Each nation sent forces that represented genuine combat capability. The total force exceeded 8,000 personnel. The evaluation would be merciless. The exercise structure involved multiple phases designed to test different aspects of cold weather combat operations. Movement to contact across frozen terrain. Defensive operations in prepared positions. Offensive operations against defended objectives. Reconnaissance and surveillance in conditions that degraded all technical systems. Sustained operations over extended duration. Each phase was evaluated by an independent assessment team with representatives from multiple nations. Scoring was standardized. Comparison was inevitable, and the results would be documented in reports that circulated to the highest levels of every participating military. Let me tell you what happened in Phase 1, because this is where the pattern was established that would hold throughout the exercise. Phase 1 was a 60-kilometer tactical movement across frozen terrain to a designated assembly area. Forces were evaluated on speed, tactical integrity, casualty rates from cold injury, and combat readiness upon arrival. Simple in concept, devastating in execution for most participants. The British Commandos completed the movement in 17 hours. 0 cold weather casualties, 100% combat readiness upon arrival. When they reached the assembly area, they immediately established security, conducted maintenance on weapons and equipment, and were prepared to commence operations within 2 hours of arrival. The next fastest completion was the Norwegian force, which makes sense given home field advantage. They completed in 19 hours. Minimal casualties. High readiness. The American Marine Battalion completed in 26 hours. 14 cold weather casualties requiring medical attention. Reduced combat readiness due to equipment issues and personnel fatigue. Still within acceptable parameters, but 9 hours behind the British and showing significantly more, where several NATO forces did not complete within the designated 30-hour window. Their movements were terminated and they were transported to the assembly area. Their Phase 1 evaluations were recorded as did not complete. This single phase established a gap that would persist. The British were not marginally better, they were substantially better, and the reasons for this gap illuminate everything that followed. The Royal Marines have maintained Arctic warfare capability since 1969. Every year, without exception, Royal Marine units deploy to Norway for extended cold weather training. This is not an occasional exercise, it is an institutional commitment maintained for over 50 years. The men of 45 Commando who participated in Northern Shield had each completed multiple Norwegian deployments. They had lived in this environment. They had operated in this environment. They knew its dangers and its possibilities intimately. American Marine Corps cold weather training is excellent but less comprehensive. The Mountain Warfare Training Center in California produces capable cold weather operators. Deployments to Norway have increased in recent years, but the depth of institutional experience differs. British Commandos treating Arctic operations as a core mission for 50 years versus American Marines treating Arctic operations as an important but not primary. Capability produces different outcomes when both are tested in actual Arctic conditions. Phase 2 was defensive operations. Each national formation was assigned a sector to defend against simulated opposing forces. Evaluation criteria included defensive position, preparation, integration of supporting arms, resilience under attack, and casualty exchange ratios during the defense. The British defensive sector was described in evaluation reports as exemplary. Fighting positions were expertly constructed using terrain and available materials. Fields of fire were interlocking. Obstacles were integrated with defensive fires. When the opposing force attacked, they were channeled into kill zones and systematically destroyed. The British casualty exchange ratio was estimated at 14-1. For every British defender lost, 14 attackers were eliminated. This ratio exceeded the performance of any other national contingent by a significant margin. The American defense was rated as effective. Positions were well constructed by conventional standards. Integration of supporting fires was good. Casualty exchange ratio was approximately 6-1. A respectable performance that would be considered successful in most contexts. In the context of Northern Shield, it was notably inferior to the British performance. Other national forces ranged from effective to needs improvement. Several forces demonstrated significant gaps in cold weather defensive operations that would require doctrinal and training remediation before they could be considered Arctic capable. If you are finding this analysis valuable and want to understand what truly separates elite forces from conventional forces, subscribe right now. I release detailed breakdowns like this every week. And next week, I am covering a special operations exchange program that produced even more surprising results. But right now, let me tell you what happened in Phase 3. Because this is where British superiority became undeniable. Phase 3 was offensive operations against defended objectives. Each national force was tasked with assaulting a prepared, defensive position held by the exercise opposing force. The objectives were equivalent in difficulty. Evaluation criteria included planning, quality, execution, timing, casualty rates, and objective seizure success. The British assault was described in multiple reports as textbook. The approach was undetected. The isolation of the objective was complete. Supporting fires were precisely coordinated with maneuver. The assault itself was violent and brief. The objective was seized with minimal friendly casualties. Time from assault initiation to objective secure was 14 minutes. The opposing force commander later said he did not know the assault was coming until it was already happening. Let me contrast this with what happened to other forces attempting similar objectives. The American assault achieved its objective, but with significantly higher casualties and longer execution time. The approach was detected, requiring adjustment under fire. Supporting fires were effective, but coordination with maneuver had gaps. Time from assault initiation to objective secure was 37 minutes. The outcome was successful, but the execution was less refined than the British equivalent. The German mountain troops, themselves elite infantry with strong alpine traditions, completed their assault in 42 minutes with moderate casualties. The French chasseurs, Alpins, required 51 minutes. Several national forces failed to seize their objectives within the designated time window and were evaluated as unsuccessful. The pattern was consistent across all evaluation criteria. The British Commandos outperformed every other participating force in every assessed category. This was not a close competition. This was a demonstration of capability differential that forced evaluators to ask uncomfortable questions about what NATO infantry training was actually producing. The Norwegian force performed second overall, which was expected given their environmental familiarity. The American force performed third, which was respectable but clearly behind both British and Norwegian performance. Other forces distributed across a range from acceptable to concerning. Now let me tell you about the American response, because this is where the story becomes genuinely interesting. The senior American officer present at Northern Shield was a Marine Corps brigadier general with combat experience spanning multiple deployments. He received the after-action briefing in a headquarters building in Bardufoss. The briefing detailed British performance across all phases. It quantified the gap between American and British results. It did not soften the message with diplomatic language. The numbers spoke clearly. What happened next was recorded by multiple officers present and later discussed in professional military education settings. As an example of institutional learning, the general did not dismiss the results. He did not question the methodology. He did not seek explanations that would excuse American performance. Instead, he asked a single question that redirected the entire post-exercise analysis. He asked, "What specifically are they doing that we are not doing, and how do we learn it?" This question reflected a professional humility that is essential to genuine military excellence, but sometimes lacking in forces that assume their own superiority. The American general was not interested in defending American performance. TPE was interested in improving American performance. The British had demonstrated superior capability. The American response was to learn from that demonstration rather than deny it. The analysis that followed was comprehensive. American and British staff officers worked together to identify specific training, doctrinal, and cultural differences that produced the capability gap. The findings were documented in reports that influenced subsequent Marine Corps training development. Let me share what they discovered. First, they identified duration and intensity of cold weather training as a primary factor. British Commandos spend more time training in Arctic conditions than American Marines. This is not because British training is harder in any absolute sense. It is because British force structure allows more specialized preparation for specific environments. Royal Marines can focus on Arctic, mountain, and amphibious operations because they are a smaller force with more specific missions. The Marine Corps must prepare for a broader range of contingencies with a larger force, necessarily distributing training time across more domains. Second, they identified equipment differences that affected performance. British cold weather equipment had been refined through decades of Norwegian deployment. Specific items that American forces used were less effective than British equivalents. The American procurement process was faster for some technologies, but slower for the specialized equipment that mattered in this environment. Recommendations for procurement changes were included in the analysis. Third, they identified doctrinal differences in how both forces approached cold weather operations. British doctrine treated cold as a primary tactical factor that shaped all decisions. American doctrine treated cold as a challenge to be overcome while executing standard tactics. This philosophical difference produced different planning, different movement techniques, different positioning, and ultimately different results. The British worked with the environment. The Americans worked against it. Fourth, and perhaps most significantly, they identified institutional commitment as the fundamental differentiator. The Royal Marines had maintained Arctic capability as a core mission for 50 years without interruption. Annual Norwegian deployments continued through budget cuts, through operational commitments elsewhere, through every organizational change. This commitment was not dependent on individual leaders or temporary priorities. It was embedded in how the Royal Marines defined themselves. American cold weather capability fluctuated with competing priorities. Sometimes it received emphasis. Sometimes it was reduced to accommodate other requirements. The institutional commitment was not equivalent to the British commitment. This inconsistency produced inconsistent capability. The American response to these findings was multifaceted. Recommendations went to Marine Corps Training and Education Command. Requests were submitted for increased training exchange with Royal Marine units. Equipment evaluation processes were initiated. Doctrine review commenced. The defeat on the exercise field was being transformed into institutional improvement through honest assessment and determined follow-through. This response is why the American military remains formidable. Despite sometimes being outperformed by specialist allies, the willingness to acknowledge gaps and address them is itself a form of strength. Forces that cannot admit weakness cannot improve. Forces that transform exercise defeats into training improvements emerge stronger than before. Let me tell you what British officers said about the American response, because their perspective illuminates something important about alliance relationships. A Royal Marine Lieutenant Colonel who served as liaison during the post-Acarces analysis told me that the American approach impressed him more than their exercise performance concerned him. He said, "Any unit can have a bad day. What matters is what you do afterward." The Americans approached this with total professionalism. They wanted to understand specifically what we did differently and why. It worked. There was no dismissal. There was genuine desire to learn. That is what makes them formidable partners. Regardless of any single exercise result, this observation captures something essential about military excellence. It is not about never failing. Every force fails sometimes. Every force encounters challenges that exceed their preparation. Excellence is about the response to those failures. The forces that learn from failure improve continuously. The forces that deny failure stagnate until reality forces painful acknowledgement. The British themselves learned from Northern Shield, though different lessons. They identified areas where Norwegian forces outperformed them in specific environmental skills. They studied German mountain troop techniques for certain types of terrain. They examined French equipment solutions that offered advantages in some conditions. The learning flowed in all directions because professional military forces approach every exercise as an opportunity to improve regardless of overall performance. Rankin. Now let me address the broader implications of Northern Shield for NATO capability and strategy. The exercise revealed a concerning pattern in NATO ground force readiness for Arctic operations. The majority of participating forces demonstrated gaps that would limit their effectiveness in actual Arctic combat. If NATO were required to defend its northern flank against a capable adversary, only a few national contingents would be fully ready for the environment. This finding influenced subsequent NATO force planning. The enhanced forward presence deployments to the Baltic states and Poland were designed partly in response to assessments like Northern Shield. The increased American Marine Corps presence in Norway reflects lessons from this and similar exercises. British commando deployments to the region have intensified. The gap between British capability and the NATO average created pressure for improvement across the alliance. The Russian threat assessment makes this particularly urgent. Russian Arctic military capability has expanded significantly since 2010. New bases, new equipment, new formations specifically designed for Arctic operations. Russia's Northern Military District treats Arctic warfare as a primary mission. If competition or conflict comes to the high north, the forces that have prepared specifically for that environment will have decisive advantages. British commandos are among the few NATO forces that meet Russian Arctic capability with equivalent Western capability. This makes British contribution to NATO northern defense disproportionately important relative to British force size. A nation of 67 million people cannot match Russian military resources in quantity, but in the specific domain of Arctic light infantry operations, British quality matches or exceeds Russian equivalents. This dynamic shapes NATO strategy in ways that are not always visible to public discussion. When alliance planners work northern scenarios, British commandos feature prominently because their demonstrated capability exceeds what other allies bring. When contingency plans are developed, British participation is often assumed rather than requested because the capability is essential. The American response to Northern Shield extended beyond immediate training adjustments. Strategic recognition of Allied capabilities influences how American planners think about coalition operations. The assumption that American forces are always the most capable in any domain was challenged by this and similar experiences. This produced more sophisticated understanding of how Allied contributions might shape future operations. In some domains, American capability remains unmatched. Air power, naval power, precision strike, logistics at scale, intelligence collection. These are areas where American resources and experience produce outcomes no ally can replicate. But in specialized ground domains, allies sometimes bring capabilities that exceed American equivalents. Acknowledging this reality enables better coalition planning. The British commandos who participated in Northern Shield were not superhuman. They were the product of specific training, specific experience, and specific institutional commitment. What they demonstrated was the result of 50 years of continuous Arctic preparation. Any military that made equivalent investment would develop equivalent capability. The British advantage is not natural or inevitable. It is earned through sustained commitment that other militaries could replicate if they chose to prioritize it. The question for alliance planners is whether that replication is necessary or whether specialization is a better approach. Should every NATO force develop Arctic capability to British standards? Or should certain forces specialize in certain domains while allies specialize in others? Current NATO practice leans towards specialization. British commandos specialize in Arctic and mountain warfare. American forces specialize in power projection and combined arms. German forces specialize in heavy, mechanized operations. French forces maintain expeditionary capability for African operations. Each nation contributes what they do best, rather than attempting to match others across all domains. This approach has advantages and disadvantages. The advantage is efficiency. Each nation focuses resources where they produce maximum relative capability. The disadvantage is dependency. If British commandos are essential for Arctic operations, then British availability becomes a constraint on alliance options. If Britain is unwilling or unable to participate in a specific contingency, Arctic capability is degraded. Northern Shield revealed both the advantage and the disadvantage of specialization. British excellence was available for this exercise and demonstrated what specialized preparation produces. But British forces cannot be everywhere. If British commandos were committed elsewhere during an Arctic crisis, NATO would face that crisis with forces that Northern Shield demonstrated were not adequately prepared. This tension shapes ongoing debates about force structure, burden sharing, and alliance commitment. The American response to Northern Shield included advocacy for increased Allied investment in Arctic capabilities. If more nations developed British-equivalent Arctic forces, alliance flexibility would increase. But such development requires sustained commitment that many nations have not historically demonstrated. Let me bring this back to what we can learn from this comparison. The British Commandos, who outperformed 15 NATO armies, did not do so through superior genetics or national character. They did so through training, through experience, through institutional commitment maintained across decades. Every advantage they demonstrated was the result of specific investments that began long before any current operator joined the service. The American response demonstrated that capability gaps can be identified and addressed if leaders approach assessment honestly. The Marine Corps that emerged from Northern Shield analysis was better than the Marine Corps that entered the exercise. The learning was painful but valuable. The alliance as a whole benefited from the exercise, regardless of national rankings. 15 nations now have better understanding of their Arctic capabilities and gaps. Training programs have been adjusted. Equipment has been evaluated. Doctrine has been reviewed. Northern Shield accomplished what military exercises are supposed to accomplish. It prepared forces for potential conflict by identifying what works and what does not. The specific rankings matter less than the learning. British Commandos earned recognition for their excellence. Americans earned recognition for their professional response. Every participating nation earned something valuable through honest participation and assessment. If you found this analysis valuable, subscribe now and hit the notification bell. Next week, I am releasing an analysis of why physical selection standards vary so dramatically across NATO Special Operations Forces, and the controversial results when those different standards were tested against each other. The week after that, I am covering a combined exercise where the results surprised everyone, including the forces that supposedly won. Drop your comments below. I want to hear from veterans who have participated in multinational exercises. How did your experience compare to what I have described? Did your force learn from Allied performance? Did you observe capability gaps that were honestly addressed or defensively denied? These perspectives shape future content, and they matter for understanding how military learning actually happens. If you learned something from this video, share it with someone who appreciates understanding how military excellence actually works. Not the simplified version where one force is always better, but the complex reality where different forces excel in different domains and learning flows in all directions. Remember that the response to defeat matters more than defeat itself. The British won Northern Shield through decades of preparation. The Americans responded to their relative performance by seeking improvement rather than making excuses. Both responses reflect professional military cultures that serve their nations well. The next time you see headlines about NATO exercises, remember that the real story is rarely about who won or lost. The real story is about what was learned and what changed because of that learning. Northern Shield produced learning that strengthened the entire alliance. That is success regardless of how national rankings were recorded. Until next time, remember that excellence is earned through sustained commitment, not claimed through momentary effort. The British Commandos who dominated Northern Shield were the product of 50 years of institutional investment. Their excellence was not inevitable. It was constructed through choices made by military leaders who understood that capability requires continuous cultivation. The American response showed that gaps can be closed when leadership prioritizes learning over pride. Both lessons matter for any military professional and for anyone seeking to understand what makes forces truly excellent. Excellence is not a destination. It is a process. The forces that maintain that process outperform those who rest on previous achievement. That is the lesson of Northern Shield. That is why British Commandos outperformed 15 NATO armies. And that is why the American response mattered as much as the British victory.